The Disneyland Monorail, an attraction that was more than just an attraction. The monorail was a symbol of Walt's vision for Disneyland and for the world. And in this episode of Fresh Baked, we'll cover all the secrets and history of this iconic Disneyland attraction. The story of the monorail is one that is deeply personal to Walt in both its origins and in its place in Disneyland history. And if you know anything about Walt Disney, you know that he did have a fascination with transportation. Many of the most legendary Disneyland attractions were focused on how guests got from one place to another. The Disneyland Railroad, the riverboats, Main Street vehicles, Autopia. But in the case of the monorail, it was more than just a means of conveyance. Walt wanted to make the world a better place. He wanted a better way for people to commute. He wanted a monorail. And this monorail was to be the cornerstone of his eventual experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot. But we'll get more into that in just a little bit. For now, it's enough to know that a monorail was always on the table for Tomorrowland, or in the case of some very early concept art, the City of Tomorrow. Now, though it's a suspended one, that is a monorail in that artwork. You see, the monorail was not a new invention, nor was it particularly futuristic. In fact, the history of the monorail that Walt and Lillian first rode in Germany while on vacation goes back to 1901. And it was on that trip to Germany that our monorail, the Disneyland Monorail, really begins. Walt and Lillian often vacationed in Europe as they were, not often recognized they could travel in peace. And on one such trip in 1958 while in Germany, they took the historic Wuppertal monorail. But this monorail was the typical suspension variety, hanging down freely from the track. However, this free-swinging suspension-style monorail made Lillian queasy, and she had asked Walt, after riding the Wuppertal, why couldn't they just make a monorail that rode above the track? Well, as it turns out, by pure luck and happenstance, Walt and Lillian were driving through the German countryside in Cologne when suddenly an elevated monorail zipped right by them across the road. They were, in fact, just minutes away from the Alweg Company and shipyard. Walt immediately found the Alweg building and began a conversation with the engineers and builders. The Alweg Company was owned by Dr. Axel Wenner Green. Green had made his fortune investing in the Electrolux vacuum company. However, the German government would not allow him to repatriate those earnings back to his home country of Sweden, so he just spent it all in Germany building monorails. And after meeting with Alweg, Walt went home with some materials on how to build monorails and immediately began working with his Imagineers to develop one of their own. And that's where Bob Gurr, Disney legend, enters the story. Now, it is said that if the ride at Disneyland has wheels, Bob probably designed it. And the history of the monorail, in this sense, is almost completely a Bob Gurr story. Gurr's initial impression of the monorail designed by Alweg was not exactly favorable. He described the practical design of the German monorail as being like a loaf of bread. It was boxy and not at all modern or futuristic. So Gurr drew on his background as an automobile designer to apply some cosmetic changes to make the vehicle look sleeker. He added tumble home, a term for adding curve to the design, to tuck it in, thus removing that boxy look. Gurr also drew inspiration from the Buck Rogers rocket ship of all things, most prominently the nose, again using a more curved design with that wraparound glass in the pilot seat. As described by Gurr, the transformation from a loaf of bread to the monorail as we know it was done in his home in about an hour. And that initial sketch led to this now famous piece of concept art that he presented to Walt Disney and his team of Imagineers. As the story goes, Walt took one look at it, turned to Bob and asked, Can you build that? And when Gurr answered yes, Walt looked around the room at his Imagineers and said, okay. And that's how things got done at Disneyland in the 50s. So Disney sent Bob Gurr, Roger Broggie, and Joe Fowler back to Germany with their math and concept art to meet again with the Alweg Company with plans to have them build the first Disneyland monorail. But as it turned out, the Alweg Company was not exactly thrilled by the radical changes that Gurr and company had proposed. One could say that they were offended that in just a few weeks, Disney had completely changed the German design that they had been developing since 1949. Further, those changes were being proposed by a film technician in Roger Broggie and an Autopia car sketch artist in Bob Gurr, as in men who were not mechanical engineers. In fact, it got bad enough that Disney decided to just build it on their own, and it wound up that Alweg's involvement was limited to sending over a single engineer to California to consult. In 1 year, the film technician and Autopia designer built that monorail, and they built it on time to coincide with the rededication of Tomorrowland, along with the submarine voyage, a project led by Bob Gurr, and the Matterhorn, where Bob Gurr also designed the legendary bobsleds. The design of the body was inspired by, and in fact almost identical to, the Viewliner. Now, this was another Bob Gurr designed vehicle that was essentially a futuristic looking train that ran alongside the Disneyland Railroad. That first monorail, Monorail Red, had 3 cars with 3 compartments each and could accommodate a total of 82 guests. And like the Viewliner, it had guests facing forward, as in guests would sit face to face as opposed to the window facing seats that we see today. In addition to sharing its design with the Viewliner, the monorail shares a bit of park history with it as well. Before the monorail, this part of the park was nothing more than the Autopia, the Viewliner, and the poorly performing Phantom boats. Meanwhile, to the north, newly opened Pacific Ocean Park was giving Disneyland a run for its money, pulling guests from Disneyland. And Walt decided that a response was needed, and thus plans were set in motion to revitalize Tomorrowland. The Phantom Boat Lagoon would be replaced by the submarine voyage, and the Viewliner would be replaced with the monorail. In the years spent perfecting the monorail design and mechanics, it went through many trials. They had to overcome the dangers inherent with single-track trains, namely, where if the design is too top-heavy, when the monorail slows down or stops during a bank, it could possibly tip over. They were working under such extreme time pressure that their first test run was just weeks before the official opening of the attraction, and that test did not go well. As Gurr relays the story, when they did that initial test, he went first in reverse a bit, then sent it forward, and after maybe an inch, the engine exploded, sending parts everywhere. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, as they pressed to meet the scheduled launch on June 14, 1959, they would keep testing every day, and every day the train would fail to make it around the track without breaking down or catching fire. And then finally, literally the night before the dedication, they were able to make a full lap around the track without stopping. But where on dedication day, Bob Gurr was ready to park the monorail at the depot, have a ribbon cutting, and then send the monorail backstage again, Walt had other plans. Walt was very proud of the monorail, so much so that he invited ABC, Art Linkletter, and Vice President Nixon to attend the debut. Now, I'm sure most die-hard Disney fans have seen the photos or video of the Nixon family cutting the ribbon, but what's really amusing about this story is that Bob Gurr, who was piloting the monorail for its inaugural launch, effectively kidnapped the Vice President of the United States. On the day of its debut, Gurr parked the monorail at the beginning of the loading ramp, and it was Gurr's understanding that they would do the dedication, then Gurr would send the monorail on its way back to the station without any guests. They had, after all, had only one successful test of the monorail in its history, and that was just the night before. But proud Papa Walt showed up at the ramp with Art Linkletter, Richard Nixon and his kids, and his Secret Service attachment. And with Gurr at the pilot seat, they all boarded the monorail for a tour of the interiors. Well, all but that Secret Service detail. Now, it was a hot summer day, so Gurr turned on the engines so he could start the air conditioning and cool down the cabins. But Walt thought that the engines had started in order to take the monorail out. And it was at this point that Walt said, "Let's go." And that was it. Without hesitation, Gurr hit the gas and took the Vice President with him, without his Secret Servicemen. As Gurr tells it, you could see the Secret Service detail excitedly trying to follow the monorail as it made its way around the tracks, nervously awaiting its return. But as they pulled into the station, Nixon's kids asked for another ride around, so Walt gave Gurr the go-ahead, and around again they went. The Vice President's reaction? He thought it was hilarious, watching his protection detail panic at Disneyland. As for Walt, this story gives us a peek at the kind of juice that he had, the kind of confidence he had as to his place in this world. He had the Vice President of the United States on his train and didn't think twice about taking off without any sort of plan or clearance or any kind of fear of reprisal. Make no mistake, Walt was in charge of his world. And with that, the Disneyland All-Wig Monorail was the first passenger-carrying monorail in the Western Hemisphere. And yes, it originally did have the All-Wig name in its title, but this had little to do with All-Wig's actual participation. Disney and Gurr built the whole thing. The All-Wig name was included only as part of a legal agreement between the two companies. After Monorail Red debuted in 1959, Monorail Blue followed shortly after on July 3rd. The original track was just 0.8 of a mile and made what was essentially just a loop around Tomorrowland. At launch, instead of heading straight out and right onto Harbor Boulevard like we know today, it made a left turn over Autopia. This reroute occurred in 1961, adding nearly 2 miles to the monorail route and its first ever stop when the train arrived at the new platform constructed at the Disneyland Hotel. With this stop, one could say that the monorail was no longer just a Disneyland attraction. It was now a legitimate mode of public transportation. In fact, you didn't even have to have a park ticket to enjoy the monorail. Did you know that guests could purchase round-trip tickets at the Disneyland Hotel stop, allowing non-park guests the chance to view the park without paying admission? Now, it sounds crazy today, but to accommodate this, monorails were actually fitted with dials on the outside that indicated what kind of guests were riding in order to alert cast members. Were they general admission guests, round-trip only guests, or mixed? Also in 1961, the monorail saw its first upgrade to the Mark II and the addition of Monorail Yellow. The Mark II was extended to 4 cars instead of 3 and included another fantastic little innovation, the Vista Dome. You see, Walt was a huge fan of allowing guests to ride in the nose of the monorail, believing it gave those lucky guests the very best view from the monorail, and I have to agree. However, he did not like the fact that guests got a view of the pilot's back. Originally, the pilot sat in the frontmost portion of the nose, while guests sat on a bench behind him. To solve this problem, the Vista Dome was installed and the pilot moved back, thus allowing guests an unimpeded view from the nose. The monorail's next upgrade arrived in 1968 with the Mark III in Monorail Green, and this time the monorail was lengthened to 5 cars. In 1971, the Mark IV was introduced to the world, but not at Disneyland. These would appear at Walt Disney World, where they were the centerpiece of Walt's vision of the city of tomorrow. The Disney World monorail connected all the parks and resorts on the Walt Disney World property, thus bringing the monorail that much closer to a true mass transit system. Meanwhile, the Mark IIIs at Disneyland managed to last until 1985, when they were finally replaced by the Mark V. Monorail Green became Monorail Purple, Monorail Yellow became Monorail Orange. The old models were stripped and redesigned, removing the unique double bubble and a more streamlined nose that resembled the Mark IV. These were also the first to be made of fiberglass, where previous versions were made of steel. In addition, they were the first monorails to feature power doors that slid open and shut, as opposed to swinging open and shut. And then over the years, the monorail went through additional track changes, upgrades, and temporary modifications. In 1994, the inbound monorail track was redirected to the Eeyore section of the parking lot in order to accommodate the construction of the Indiana Jones Adventure Show building. In 1999, the outbound monorail track entered a new park, sort of. That new park was Disney's California Adventure, and it was built around the existing track, thus allowing the monorail to pass through the Hollywood backlot, the main entrance, and the Grand Californian Hotel before arriving at the downtown Disney stop, which had also been completely demolished and rebuilt. Now, many have speculated since then if or when there would be a third monorail stop for California Adventure. However, this is not practical for a variety of reasons. For one, the outbound trip from Tomorrowland to downtown Disney is already incredibly short. Guests would barely have time to get comfortable in their seat before stopping again at DCA. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, California Adventure is a separate admission ticket from Disneyland. As such, any guest not holding an annual pass or a park hopper would not be allowed to exit. But this would no doubt lead to confusion and anxiety among guests and cast members trying to negotiate who could exit at California Adventure and who could not. In 2007, the trains were upgraded to Mark 7s, the most recent upgrade, and were the first to feature the window-facing central bench seat that we use today. Over the years, the monorail was used to promote new attractions or new movies coming to Disney. For example, there was the Finding Nemo monorail in 2007, in the Cars monorail in 2012. But its classic imagery is how we all know and love the monorail, both today and throughout the history of Disneyland. It was always Walt's dream to build a highway in the sky, not just the monorail, but the people mover and the skyway buckets too. But history has shown that he didn't quite get there. Though there are monorails in use today, including ones in Seattle and Las Vegas here in the US, plus many more in Japan, China, and Germany, they haven't reached anything close to the vision that Walt had, and one is left to wonder why. They occupy less real estate, plus they're quiet and provide competitive rider capacity to other forms of public transportation. Some cite the cost, which can be more in some installations, or the impact on the environment, such as the additional foundational requirements for monorails versus more simple railway tracks. Others mention the visual intrusion on sightlines, where traditional trains do not obstruct views or available sunlight, while others speak of tradition. But it's very possible that Walt's involvement and its introduction at Disneyland contributed to its maybe, not being taken as seriously as it should. The reality is, in the US, the monorail was nothing more than an amusement park attraction. Its famous use at Disneyland and Disney World cemented its view in the public eye. It wouldn't be difficult to believe that city planners who are accustomed to classic, entrenched systems, such as trains and subways, might view a monorail as being less than a serious endeavor because of its association with Disneyland. But the good news is that the monorail is still at Disneyland, alive, well, and amazing. It's one of the signature attractions at the park, and rightfully so, due to Walt's involvement and its impact on the history and status as an icon of the park. The monorail will forever be linked to Disneyland in the same way as the Disneyland Railroad, the Main Street, or Pirates of the Caribbean. The monorail is Disneyland. And so concludes our best secrets in history of the Disneyland Monorail. We sure hope you enjoyed this episode and ask that you like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. And until next time, fresh baked! We've got lots more videos for you to see, so grab a churro and check out some of our other videos and have your mind blown by how much fun we're having. We truly are the best of Disney Bake Fresh Daily. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time. Fresh Baked!